Hey there. Welcome to the Rebranding Christianity podcast, a space for honest conversation about the state of Christianity in America, specifically the state of evangelical Christianity. As we've discussed already in previous episodes, Christianity in America has a serious branding problem. For the most part, Christianity is not known for the main thing Jesus told Christians to be known for: love. Public perception of Christianity has been in decline for at least a couple of decades, but it's been in rapid decline over the last 5 years or so. Why? We're going to talk about that in this episode. Thanks for joining us. I'm Greg Holmes.
And I'm Cindy Park. Today, we're continuing our conversation with Jeff Jones and Mike Hogan, authors of the book Rebranding Christianity. You know, I think this book could have been written 10 years ago and it would have been relevant, but there's something about the last handful of years that have made these conversations urgent. But before we jump into that, we want to say hey to Mike and Jeff.
Hey, guys. Hey.
Yeah, welcome back.
And by the way, when you say that, you know, the initial idea was almost 10 years ago to write the book and dragged our feet. And then glad we did, and at least to get through COVID and to kind of see what happened there and to see things accelerate and things revealed about Christianity and the church.
Yeah.
It took longer than it probably should have, but we had some good steak dinners in the meantime.
That's true. That's right. A lot of conversation.
But because you talked about COVID, Jeff, so in the book you call it the COVID Accelerator. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, those trends were already true in terms of the perception of Christianity going downhill, the emerging generations disconnecting from Christianity more and more. But the COVID period, those years just accelerated all those trends, like it did a lot of trends, you know, and you know, all kinds of things. But it sort of ratcheted up maybe 10 years ahead. And so it just sped everything up really quickly. And it also revealed what was going on in Christianity, too, in terms of, you know, it was kind of like, you know, we talk about getting COVID tests. COVID was kind of a test of the church, you know, of Christianity to see, hey, what's really animating us? What's really motivating us? What really is at the core? And, you know, it could have gone better.
So what was it about COVID or the things that happened during those years that you felt like accelerated that decline? Yeah,
you know, what we talk about in the book is there's sort of this perfect storm of three storm systems, so to speak, coming together to form this one massive challenge for our culture, test for the church. And I think the way Christianity was seen to respond to it is what caused the acceleration. So you had the contentious presidential election, you had the race stuff bubble up, you know, in a massive way, and George Floyd and so on.
Yeah.
And then just the Christian response to the pandemic itself and the lockdowns and masks and whatever. All those things kind of came together to form not only a big test for the church, but just the way it ended up going through it, a big accelerator of people being repulsed by the church.
So do you think, did it have to go this way? So you were talking about these as being as cultural accelerators in the way people view Christianity. Could these have been accelerators in the other direction? Like, could the pandemic or racial tension and political upheaval, could those have actually been catalysts for people to have a refreshing view of Christianity?
Yeah, absolutely. It should have been. You know, it was maybe as hard, a global pandemic where, you know, millions of people and lose their lives is a horrific tragedy. Okay, yeah. So I'm not trying to make light of that. However, it was and has been through the centuries a huge opportunity for the gospel, and in our culture, maybe the greatest opportunity in my lifetime, certainly, to present or just to demonstrate the love of Jesus in a compelling way.
Yeah.
And over the centuries, it was remarkable. Like for example, in the first centuries of the church, you know, when the plagues first started coming and people didn't understand contagion the same way we do. I mean, there's all kinds, it was just this horrific time, you know, of fear and all these, as much as 25 to 30% of people in the Roman Empire died and, you know, these things. And so it was a time of great fear. And Christians stepped up in a major way. And for example, in the larger cities, as they started to figure out just that that if you hang around with sick people, you're going to get sick. So they left the sick and the dying in their homes and went out to the countryside. And people
left them to die.
Yeah, just would starve to death and die of thirst. And most of those people, if they had been cared for, would have actually survived. And so Christians went on these missions where they would, at risk to their lives, go in and find these people in these that had been abandoned in their houses and bring them first to their homes, then to their gathering places. Eventually they started what became hospitals because there were so many people, and that's why church and hospital are connected together. And at great risk to their lives, because some of them did catch the disease and some of them did die, but they were fine with that because that's what we do. Like, that's how we roll. We move toward need. We move toward sickness. And they did. And most of those people did survive. And you can imagine, right? Just the conversations when their family comes back who'd abandoned them, and like, dude, really? But look at these Christians, they took me in, and what a display of the love of Jesus and in a way that's hard to argue about. And it's one of the reasons Christianity became so compelling and began to grow so rapidly. Because exactly what Jesus said, this is how people will know you're my disciples, that you love one another that way. Huge opportunity. And that was largely whiffed. It's not that all Christians whiffed. I love the Mark Twain quote that says, where he said, all generalizations are wrong, including this one, which is a great quote. But because there were people who did wonderful things, right? But that's not what got the press. That's not what got out there. And so what got out there was Christians making it about our rights, or, hey, nobody can tell us not to meet. We're going to protect our Christian freedoms, and nobody can tell us to wear a mask when we gather, or nobody, all that kind of thing. And the reason, for the not gathering, right, if you remember, was flattening the curve. So hospitals don't fill up, protecting the most vulnerable. I mean, that's the kind of thing we should say, that's right. We would want to support that, right? In love, we care about but instead making about Christian freedom, and I'm going to stand for that. It's actually the opposite of the Christian ethic. So the Christian ethic is I give up my freedom for the sake of the other. Love limits freedom. I set aside my freedom in love for the sake of the other. And that's how we roll. That's our ethic. And to the extent that didn't happen, and certainly what was publicized was the not great response to that, it showed an already skeptical world that these people just care about themselves.
So do you think then, clearly, like in modern times, we had a different reaction than those first century Christians? And so do you think the circumstances changed us, or do you think that the circumstances just revealed something that was hidden within us?
Yeah, I think it was a tell. I think it revealed something that was in us. Kind of like when Lake Powell and Lake Mead, were receding. Now I think they're kind of, doing better. But when they were receding, and you started, started finding all these bodies that the mafia had left, and old cars and all kinds of things. It just revealed what was there,
kind
right?
of lowered the waterline on who we really are.
And I think the COVID time period did that for evangelical Christianity, kind of revealed what was there. And unfortunately, kind of what it showed is a lot of self-interest, a lot of pursuit over my own comfort, my own rights, over the ethic that we're called to live. And so it was a test. And I think and again, the generalization is really hard, right?
Right.
But overall, I mean, I don't know what God would give, what grade God would give, but I know the grade our culture gave, which was an F, in terms of what they saw and their perception of the Christian response. And so it was a huge step backwards. When it could have been a huge step forward. Again, by far the biggest opportunity we've had, at least in my lifetime, to demonstrate the reality of the gospel and the love of Jesus in a compelling way.
Yeah. All right, I have a question for both of y'all, Mike and Jeff. I know you both well enough to know that neither one of you just enjoy picking a fight and having people mad at you, like that kind of stuff. But in this kind of chapter that we're talking about in your book, I mean, you talk about the Christian response to the pandemic, and you also talk about sort of the political issues and races, like that type of thing. Things that will tend to rile people up. People are kind of locked and loaded to respond, all of that kind of stuff. And my sort of general question to you both is, why did you go there? To kind of talk about some specific things, knowing that people might be kind of locked and loaded on that. Like, why did you feel like it was worth the risk, and what was your hope? Let's just go there and talk about it. What do you hope?
Yeah, well, I think all three of the components of the perfect storm of the racial issues, the political season that was contentious, and the pandemic itself were all tests to see what our priorities were and where we're really coming from. And are we thinking biblically about these things or not? And therefore, I it's more the thinking biblically part of it that matters to me as a Christian leader. And are we putting our biblical filter ahead of any other filter? So, for example, with the politics thing, it's not about is the left right or the right or whatever. That I don't even care about that. The truth is they're all incomplete. But are people thinking biblically about issues that help us relate to our culture in the political sphere in a healthy way? And felt like, man, that's not what happened, and so what's going on there? And same way with race. Racial reconciliation is a biblical issue.
Right. That's our issue.
That is our issue. It's part of the gospel, Ephesians 2, that it's the gospel is not just about God reconciling at the cross God to people, but also people to people, and breaking down the dividing wall of the races and creating in the church one new man out of the many, one new community out of all these races. And that is one of the reasons Jesus came. And so that's our thing. And we can talk more about that. But of course, we've talked about the response to the pandemic itself. So it's not that trying to just pick on controversial issues to be controversial. It's just saying, hey, let's just make sure we're thinking biblically and talk about that, and then that can guide how we engage race, how we engage politics, how we handle a pandemic. But let's start with the biblical filter.
Mike, how do you feel? So Jeff is coming at it from a pastoral sense, and we have to think biblically. You're much more as a business leader, but also as a Christian, and you care about these things. Why is it important that we kind of talk about some of these things directly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so to your point, speaking both personally and from a kind of a brand perspective, I think there's issues out there that I think, they just have to be addressed. And I think nobody benefits from sort of running away from these sort of things. So if I'm a brand that's in everybody's cupboard or whatever, there are certain things I have to speak to. What I think, though, is in some of the examples that we give in the book, Patagonia would be a good example. Maybe Tylenol might be another one, where brands had to confront, so sort of emotional, and anything from a really serious issue like people dying to really emotional issues like climate change. But what I like is the example where rather than weighing into it and saying, let's start an argument, let's talk about who's right and who's wrong, let's make somebody the bad guy, they said, all we're doing is we're supporting a positive value. And I think in the book, we're less concerned about saying, look at what happened that was wrong, but rather here's an example of what's right. And I think what we would find, and I think people respect this in the brand world too, if you take and you esteem those things which are good and you hold those up as examples, I think people will respect that. And I think most people will respond positively to that. Most people would say, hey, I could do better. I could be better about it. And yes, that I need to be reminded every once in a while of what I stand for and how to do that. And so I think our hope is more about holding up a positive example as opposed to going in and kind of, retelling history and going in and bayoneting the wounded.
Right.
Jeff, I'm thinking about what you were saying earlier about what our response could have been. And I know that you weren't making these decisions independently. It's not like you're a dictator and you're just making all these decisions for our church. But because you're like kind of the face of the church, it's easy to attack you. So I know a criticism that you received during this season was that you were too woke, and people were just like, hey, stay in your lane, buddy. Like, just preach the Bible. Don't talk about politics and race and these things. How did you process that, and how do you respond to that?
Yeah. So, you're trying to get me in trouble. Right? These trigger words like woke, right? Either people are like, yeah, that's great, or no, that's terrible, right? That's the culture we're in. And as a church, we reach both perspectives, so, and I love that we do. And, you've got the anti-woke people and the woke people, and really Christianity rises above all of that. And that's what I believe we've got to do is keep the conversation above, is it this political way to go? Is it woke, or is it anti-woke? And this political, is it progressive or conservative? Or the truth is, all of those answers are very incomplete. All those answers are flawed. I give no hope to any of that. You have to make decisions about some of that stuff, but ultimately what our identity is and our focus has to be is above that whole conversation, and say, hey, we're about the kingdom of God. We're about him, and we represent him, and we don't represent any one nation on earth, and we don't give our brand to any political party or solution, because that's not where we think the ultimate solutions are. And so we want to, again, put our biblical filter ahead of all those other filters. And once you do that and you think biblically about things like that some would consider woke positively or anti-woke negatively, things like justice or race or whatever it is you're talking about, let's talk about it from a biblical perspective and think about it there. Like justice, for example, can be a trigger word. Oh, see, you're talking about justice. Here you go. And well, justice is that's the God's thing. Like it's a biblical thing. Like, Malachi, he said, hey, there's not a whole lot I'm asking of you, but I do ask that you do justice, right? That you love mercy, right? And you walk humbly. So that's not some woke thing to care about justice, right? It's God. That's, but what is biblical justice? And what is justice from God's perspective? And then we can apply that in every other sphere. Right. Or issues of race, let's say, which you think people get grumbly, or if you talk about race, critical race theory, whatever it is, all the triggers in buzzwords out there. And just say, no, let's just look at what God says about race and about racial reconciliation and the hope for that in the gospel, and how it can only be found that way. It's forgiveness and taking responsibility and repentance and all that kind of stuff is necessary. So I just say, man, we're not trying to be woke or anti-woke or whatever label you want to give it. We're just trying to think biblically about issues that God cares about. I mean, those two examples are issues that he cares about deeply.
It's got to be very difficult to be a communicator and a leader when every cultural issue, every topic has been sort of hungry hippoed by one side or the other. Like one side or the other owns that issue. And so whenever you even bring up the word, I would assume you sort of feel all the cultural baggage that's coming with that, and you now have to deal with all the cultural baggage at the same time rather than just saying what the Bible says.
Yeah. And so what I've tried to do is just sort of rise above it. Yeah. And just say, but I think Paul, it'd be interesting, if he was going into a progressive area and where wokeness is valued, he would have a different approach than if he was going into a conservative area where it was scary or a bad thing. But it's like Mars Hill, where he goes to here's this hill with all these idols on them, right? So you might think, as a Christian leader, primary leader of the Christian movement, he would go up to Athens with all these pagan idol worshipers.
And speak the truth.
Right? And say, idols are crazy and terrible, and I'm going to tear them down, and you just try to stop me. But that's not what he did. He looks at one of the idols was the idol to the unknown God. And he just says, hey, can we talk about that one? Because I think I might know something about the unknown God. I think he actually made himself known. And they have this incredible conversation, right? So much so that the philosophers and all these people ask him to come back. We want to hear more. We want to talk more, right? And so I think as we, with all these little trigger words, and rather than reacting to our culture, let's just listen and talk to our culture, right? So you think about like wokeness or whatever, you say, well, I mean, because really what woke means originally was just being aware of issues going on in the world.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing, right? Now, how people take that and what they do with it could be crazy and all that. I get it. But just say, if I was going to Seattle or something and agree, hey, can we just talk about what woke might look like? Because it's actually a lot richer and deeper than a progressive perspective.
Yeah.
And so from a Jesus perspective, let's really go there. Like, let's really talk about what this might look like, to be aware and engage in the real issues of our world in a compelling way. Let's talk about Jesus, And so I know that's not exactly what you asked, but I just think if we can, it's an example just of how to engage culture in a way where we don't just react to these things like everybody else is reacting, and just say, hey, let's talk about that. And let's take the conversation bigger.
One of the things that I love about this book, Mike, is your contribution of the case studies that are in there. I think it just adds such a different perspective to see how really good leaders, really smart people that are running companies that face similar things, like how do you do it well and how do you not do it well. And Mike, one of the case studies that you write about is Patagonia. What stands out to you, and you mentioned that just a little earlier in the conversation, what stands out to you about Patagonia as they build a brand in a positive way, even in the midst of a contentious issue like climate change, so they have a value, but they're also building a brand and stuff. So what stands out? Like, what is the Patagonia story? What stands out to them, stands out to you about them? And what can the church learn?
Sure. So, speaking of trigger words, climate change.
Yeah.
And, I realize that term's been politicized in recent years, and people disagree a lot on, causes and remedies. But long before climate change became a thing or became mainstream, Patagonia was really committed to protecting the environment. And I don't think there are a lot of people out there who would say that protecting the environment is a bad thing. So I'll pick up there because I think that's really what the brand's been about. And, over the years, Patagonia has been a champion of a number of things. One is, before they became mainstream, one is recycling. One is paying a fair wage for overseas work. Another is just, having and supporting and hosting the kind of events that get people out of doors into the natural environment and cause them to sort of fall in love with it and develop appreciation for it. And that's been a big deal. So what I really like is that they've done this in a positive way, and it's impressive because they put their money where the mouth is, right? They put purpose before profitability. Another thing I like about their approach, though, is it's not about you won't find them arguing or criticizing or making someone else the bad guy, right? They're not talking about what's wrong. They're trying to get people to fall in love with the value and then do something positive. They just make a difference. So if we put it in the context of the church, I think the specific example is about leading people with the positive examples and avoiding being drawn into these broader arguments or sort of demonizing people that don't agree with you. Maybe just see them as people who haven't caught the vision yet, but certainly not seeing them as the enemy.
Yeah.
So, Mike, in the example of Patagonia, the company decided to give away ownership of the company and have all their profits managed by another company committed to environmental causes. So instead of increasing profits for shareholders, they decide to give away power and profit. Is that good business strategy? Is that a good idea for them to give away all of that instead of holding on to that for themselves, for those that are inside the company?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I really like the question, and I like the way you phrased it because you distinguish between sort of using the resources to benefit the people who are already there versus sort of serving the broader community. And I think that's exactly where Patagonia was at. So first of all, Patagonia was owned by one person, Yvon Chouinard, and that's I only try to pronounce that name once. So it was, when we say shareholders, it was him, right? And there were a number of things he could have done, right? He could have not sold the company and kept the money. He could have sold the company and given the money to a cause. But the reason he didn't do that was because he determined that the mission of the company was actually to continue to protect the environment, and he wanted that to happen even after his death. So if he'd sold the company, even given away the money, then the company could have become whatever it was by whoever the new owners were. And so by doing it this way, the cause is protected, right? The ownership's maintained. The ownership is maintained by people with similar values, let's put it that way. So, when I think about the church in that context, I think about a lot of things that already happen today. I mean, there's a lot of good things happening. People would give money, let's say, to build a church or whatever, and that's maybe a small example. To give school or something, that's maybe a small example, but it's people giving some of their power and resources to something that's going to serve the broader community or going to serve the next generation. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's a big difference between a church that only spends on things that benefit the people who are currently there versus a church that puts its resources and time into things that benefit the broader community and the next generation. And that's where we saw the similarity with Patagonia.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, I love Patagonia as a positive example of what we're talking about. And I think another positive example I just want to throw out there before we close our conversation is there actually were a number of Christians, they're not the ones who got the publicity, but there were a number of churches and all that handled the pandemic in a way that could have been better, sure, but I'm proud of them, So as a church, we tried to make the decisions with the principle of love first. And that meant the way we handled when do we close, when do we open, do we wear masks or not, but also just saying, this is such a scary time in our community. How can we meet the biggest needs and come around anxious people with love and care and help? And we did a campaign in the middle of the pandemic to raise a bunch of money, and we did, so that we were able to say to every essential worker in the Dallas area, if you need childcare, we've got excellent childcare and it's going to be free. Which was the biggest need. Or we came
through YMCA partnership.
Yeah, through the YMCA partnership. And as we hospitals and all that we came around and other things to just meet needs, and people were in tears, just saying, I can't believe you would do this for me. Like, why would you, what's the catch? What's going on? And so there were all kinds of wonderful things that happened. I do think the reputation of Jesus grew. And the other thing that happened for us as a church by not meeting for a while is that we saw that, church didn't shut down just because we stopped our largest gatherings. Church, that's not what church is.
Yeah.
It's cool that we can, gather in large, huge groups, but that's really not what church is. Church is this movement of God on this planet displaying radical love, and that was able to amp up. That got bigger, not smaller. So we were the church activated even more, and I think it taught us and reminded us what church actually is. And it's not just the big thing, come and listen. It's actually the church displaying love in our world. And so God did do beautiful things in the pandemic and taught us some important things to the extent that we were willing to move forward in love, not in self-seeking or some other thing. It's just, unfortunately, as a whole, that it wasn't churches like that got the press.
Well, thanks for adding that in, because I think you're right. And there was some great things at Chase Oaks and other churches that we follow. There were some great things that happened, and it was really encouraging. But as we've been talking about in the rest of this episode, for the most part, that's not kind of how at least that's not the perception of how evangelical church responded. And at any time when there's big cultural moments that come up and there are dicey cultural issues, there's going to be disagreement, and there could be disagreement even around this table. And disagreement is okay. But I think that one thing that all Christians can hopefully agree on is that Jesus told us to be known for our love primarily. And the perfect storm of cultural circumstances over the last several years was probably a squandered opportunity for the Christian community. Now, in some of that, and I'm kind of talking about what we're going to talk about in the next episode. Some of that may have stemmed from our view of ourselves as Christians and also Americans. Like, how does our American identity mesh with our Christian identity? That's a whole nother conversation that we're going to talk about in our next episode. I hope you can join us.